Max, let's begin. Okay. Hello, everybody. I think it is November 30th, 2023. We like to mark these things for a recording. First, the big story is Kissinger. We were commenting or sort of joking with Max Bergmann about how much time the international media had to write the obituary. I mean, he died at the age of 100. I'm sure that there were obituaries written as early as 20 years ago, probably. So they've had plenty of time to think about this man. We have to mention him because he's such a significant figure in the things we discuss. I should say, after reading the following book, The Blood Telegram by Gary Bass, I must say that that book tilted me towards the edge of really not admiring this man. But you can't deny that he's had a major influence. I don't know if quotes are helpful or if anybody remembers quotes, but the Washington Post today had some pretty good ones. Kissinger, we should remember him for his good and bad things. I think the bad outweighed the good, but that's a personal opinion. He was a man of subtlety. He was a man of subtlety, a man who appreciated ambiguity. And in that sense, he stands as a very good example of the way we need to be thinking. Couple of quotes, and you may remember them, maybe not. Policy is the art of weighing probabilities. Mastery of it lies in grasping the nuances of possibilities. To attempt to conduct it as a science must lead to rigidity, for only the risks are certain, the opportunities are conjectural. You see the subtlety and the ambiguity. And then one more from George Will, who was a conservative columnist. Well, a couple. Will, I think, was he in his piece today, he has a mixed view, for good and ill, he says. But we can assume that Will had a certain admiration or respect for something. And he has two quotes. History knows no resting places and no plateaus. The management of a balance of power is a permanent undertaking, not an exertion that has a foreseeable end. You know, we've talked in this class about diplomacy as gardening. George Kennan saw it as gardening. George Shultz saw it as gardening. The need for patience and for the long haul, the long scenario. Kissinger should be remembered for understanding that. And then finally, the statesman's task is to rescue an element from the pressure of circumstance. I think, to me, the meaning of these quotes is that he saw the world and its challenges as ambiguous, never a certain and positive answer to anything. I think we can certainly say that he was very insightful in seeing the world that way. When we look at the conflicts at this time, we know that there is no easy solution to any of them. For those on the call who are calling in from Kenya, I will put this on our Google Classroom. Chatham House, oh dear, I forget what day. It's with, I believe it's next week. The Secretary for Foreign and Diaspora Affairs, Secretary Mudavadi of Kenya, will be talking about Kenya's foreign policy challenges. I'll put this on the Google Classroom for everybody's use. So, Max Bergmann, thank you for joining us from CSIS. You've been in many places. You've been in the State Department. Remind us a bit. We've looked at your bio. Remind us of the parts of the bio you would want us to focus on. Secondly, what are you working on these days? And third, let's talk about economic sanctions. Do they ever work?
Great. Well, thanks, Dan. It's really great to be with everybody. I am the director of the Europe-Russia-Eurasia program here at CSIS. So that means I deal with everything involving Russia, Ukraine, as well as Europe and the European Union, and sort of try to get into the weeds of the EU and also NATO. I was in the Obama administration, where I was in the State Department in a number of different roles, but my major focus and responsibility was helping to oversee U.S. arms sales and security assistance globally, and that was not sort of just focused on Europe, but focused on the entire world. That's been helpful, I think, in trying to navigate some of the issues right now that we're having with Ukraine security assistance. I should say to Dan, just on recalling Kissinger. Kissinger actually has an affiliation with CSIS. He still has an office actually on my floor down the hall. And the book that I think I would recommend, that I would recommend as well, is The Blood Telegram. Dan sort of beat me to it. And for me, as someone who sort of goes less on the realist side of foreign policy, more on believing that we need to sort of align our foreign policy more with our values, I think what's really instructive about that book is, on the one hand, Kissinger is sort of known for the kind of master stroke of engagement with China during the Cold War, bringing China, sort of creating a wedge between China and the Soviet Union. And I think that was very impactful. But the other element of that was a complete disregard of India, alignment with Pakistan, actually using Pakistan as an entree to develop ties with Beijing. And I think being on the wrong side of what was then a civil war between East and West Pakistan, which then led to a significant loss of life in Bangladesh, and really soured the U.S.-India relationship for decades. And what the United States has basically had to do over the last 20 years in trying to rebuild our relationship with India is to sort of make up for the ground that was lost, I think, in part to the policies that Kissinger pursued. And we haven't yet fully succeeded there. And I think when you look back at Kissinger's tenure, everyone looks at China, but not the India dimension, which I think is incredibly significant. And that's sort of when a foreign policy not driven truly by the practical realist interests, sort of not taking account of regime character, I think shows some of its limitations. At least
let me just summarize a little bit what the Blood Telegram is about. Kissinger's boss, President Nixon, was obsessed with China, of course, and of course Kissinger was successful in being the middleman, but the only way he could do it was through the country that we had relations with that was friendly with China was Pakistan, which at that time included East and West Pakistan, that is Pakistan, Bangladesh. There's the famous and quite funny incident where Kissinger was in Islamabad. He said, "I think I have a stomach ache." Remember this, Max? And he hid in his hotel room. We were told. In fact, he made a secret trip to Beijing, and but the price paid. And this is just, if one can believe Gary Bass, and I think I do, the cost of getting that connection to Beijing was the military regime of West Pakistan at that time succeeded in getting illegal arms deliveries, and Max is a specialist on this, from the United States, illegal, done by Henry Kissinger as the price of having this contact with Beijing. Result, Max calls it loss of life. I think we can say, not exactly genocide, but enormous massacres inflicted on East Pakistan by the West Pakistani military government, thanks to Henry Kissinger. Enough on that. I'll post the book and the ISBN. It's a gripping read, and as Max has just said, it makes us decide: should we be realists or should we have values? There's no easy middle ground, I think, to that. Sorry, that's all from me. That's the Blood Telegram. Yeah.
So maybe to sanctions, and what I was going to do is sort of talk about sanctions as a foreign policy tool, and then look at them and how they've been used vis-a-vis Russia and Ukraine. And then happy to have a conversation about anything related to the war, to Russia, to U.S. foreign policy in general. So sort of at your disposal. Let me, I think the to start in talking about sanctions, the major question is, do sanctions work? And in some ways, I think it's too simplistic a question, because to work to do what, right? So oftentimes we say, do they work to deter? I think they have a very mixed bag. Do they work to impose costs? I think they definitely do impose costs. But do they impose the costs that are significant enough to then change the regimes or behavior? Well, oftentimes not. And so I think sanctions are oftentimes seen as this sort of wonder tool, this wonder weapon that can be magically deployed and sort of solve all problems. And I think that's the wrong way to really think about them. First, sort of a background on sanctions. So part of what oftentimes makes economic and financial sanctions very impactful when the United States does them, or what gives the United States oftentimes the ability to leverage sanctions, is the fact that the dollar and the U.S. financial system is central to the global economy. Companies need to do business in dollars and trade in dollars. They need access to the U.S. financial system. And maybe if that country doesn't, well, the other Western companies that they're dealing with do. So even if you're an Iranian business and could find a willingness to do business with a UAE company, well, if or a company in another part of the world, well, that company then could be subject to U.S. sanctions by doing business with Iran. And frankly, they tend to have much greater business interests in the United States and maybe it's not even the United States, but just needing to not be subject to U.S. Sanctions, because if they're sanctioned by the U.S., then that means they lose access to, frankly, international capital and the international financial system. So it gives the United States a tremendous leverage and influence over the global economy. We still have the world's largest economy, and the dollar is central to the global financial system. So that's the sort of basis of our leverage, and why the U.S. then sees sanctions as such a kind of a go-to tool. And the other reason why it's a very go-to tool is it doesn't involve sending U.S. forces to patrol a region or into battle. It doesn't require Americans to die. It doesn't require us to spend any money to, in fact, do those sanctions. Now, there may be an economic cost if we're stifling business or oil production or energy production. Maybe that increases energy costs, but those costs are much more indirect. So hence, it's oftentimes a tool that policymakers will default to because it's accessible. It's easy for U.S. policymakers. It doesn't require a lot of economic trade-offs. It doesn't require space in the budget. So I think let's talk about maybe the kind of, I won't give a long history of sanctions, but sanctions when it came to Russia and Ukraine I think have had essentially a mixed bag in terms of their impact and effectiveness. But I think when you look at sanctions otherwise, I think there's not necessarily I think there can be a more positive, I think there's a relative positive story to say. I would call myself a sanctions optimist.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think that sanctions are oftentimes fail to change the behavior of the regime in which you are applying sanctions against. So we oftentimes see, whether it's Cuba and our embargo, has the embargo against Cuba resulted in a change of behavior of the Cuban government or change the Cuban government? The answer is no. Have sanctions against North Korea resulted in North Korea not developing a robust nuclear and missile program? The answer is no. However, what I would say is that sanctions may not deter North Korea, but I think they deter other countries from following North Korea's path. That if a country adopts that violates sort of, in this case, the Non-Proliferation Treaty, North Korea signed on to it, and this is also the case with Iran, then suddenly they are subject to robust, and this is not just U.S. sanctions, but actually UN sanctions in the case of North Korea and Iran. Uh, then they are subject to intense sanctions, and no one wants to be an impoverished country like North Korea, or not many do. And so, in that sense, I would say sanctions have played actually a critical role in creating a deterrent effect to other countries to going down, I think, the nuclear path. And if we had not sanctioned North Korea, and if North Korea sanctions were not in place against North Korea, I think it opens up the question of, well, what would the impact be globally? And I would say it's likely that other countries would say, well, there's not much to deter us from also developing a nuclear arsenal. So, the problem with this argument is that it's a counterfactual. It sort of can't be proven either way. But to me, I do think that sanctions are a way of imposing costs on a regime. And if there are no costs that are put against a government or a country or companies that are essentially violating, in this case, an international agreement with the Non-Proliferation Treaty, or taking other actions that are deemed by, I think, largely by the broader international community or by the United States and allies, um, then then it's more likely for other countries to follow and adopt that behavior. So creating costs in the international system, I think, is important. So let's turn to the Russia-Ukraine case. So in 2014, obviously, you all know, Russia's illegal annexation of Crimea and the Donbass and its invasion of Ukraine, that suddenly became a real test for U.S. sanctions designers and experts, in part because the United States had never sanctioned an economy as large as Russia. And in designing those sanctions, they were both the most robust sanctions that we've ever done. And I think in retrospect, we're clearly nowhere near as strong or as impactful as hoped for. What we also saw in 2014 was the U.S. Creating a sanctions package, then wanting to go to the European Union, or going to the European Union in the spring of 2014. I was in the State Department at the time, and the EU being incredibly hesitant and risk averse to putting sanctions on Russia. And this was for some, I think, fairly straightforward economic reasons, that European economies are much more, were, especially in 2014, much more intertwined with the Russian economy. And I think the shock of 2014 hadn't quite caught up to European governments, particularly in March, April, May, June. And it really took the downing of MH17, which happened, I think, in August, if I remember correctly, to sort of shake Europeans out of their slumber, in which hundreds of European citizens died, EU citizens, Dutch citizens. And then that prompted the EU to adopt a sanctions package. Now, what happened with those sanctions is they did have an impact on the Russian economy, I think quite negative impact on the Russian economy. You look at Russia's sort of growth rates and the shock to the ruble currency, that did essentially make Russia poorer. Now, what happens over time with sanctions, and this is, I think, particularly clear and evident between the period of 2014 and 2022, is the impact of sanctions erode over time. So you will go and you'll sanction that Russian company or that Russian bank or that sector of the Russian economy. And what happens is that Russian company will change its name, will reincorporate, will figure out ways to get around sanctions. So there were sanctions against all aspects of the Russian economy. And Russia, in response, actually cut itself off from tried to impose counter sanctions against French cheeses and other things. And what we see is that capitalist economies, and Russia's economy is still relatively free market, figure out ways to adapt. We then saw the emergence suddenly of a Russian cheese industry, boutique cheese industry that could make up for the loss of French cheeses. So, and we saw that kind of throughout Russia's throughout the Russian economy. So I think sanctions in 2014, 15, 16 have had a real impact, but that impact faded over time. Also, the aggressiveness of the West in enforcing those sanctions also fades. And I think I saw that myself in government, where by 2016, the Secretary of State was engaged with Lavrov over talks in Syria, talks in Yemen. Suddenly, the pressure being put on the Treasury Department, on State Department bureaucracy, on the intelligence community to find and basically play whack-a-mole to find the new Russian companies and sanction them, because you have to continuously maintain and update sanctions for them to be effective. You have to keep identifying new, how is Russia getting around your sanctions? Then you have to sanction that company. It requires a lot of bureaucratic effort. And then you have to when you are designing a sanctions package, you have to identify the targets, then you have to get approval, and then it has to be announced. And this all of that takes a lot of work. And when attention starts to shift elsewhere on the foreign policy side, sometimes that bureaucratic energy and effectiveness begins to wane. And that was particularly true, frankly, on the EU side, where we were very concerned that every 6 months the EU would have to renew sanctions. And whether it would or not, we were very concerned about. But it always did. But after a number of years, the impact on the Russian economy had faded. So let's fast forward to 2022. Obviously, sanctions did not work at deterring Vladimir Putin from invading Russia. I think President Biden tried to signal very clearly that there would be, I think he described it as sanctions from hell against Russia, that it should invade Ukraine. But I think Putin's experience from 2014 to 2022 was that Russia could absorb sanctions, and that Russia was also preparing for this war by building up significant financial reserves, by stockpiling wealth, that in case of war, in case of being cut off from devastating sanctions that would impact the Russian economy, well, you have this 600 billion, I think that was roughly the amount, war chest in the Russian central bank that could absorb any economic blow. So sanctions did not deter Vladimir Putin from invading Ukraine, quite clearly. But I think he was rather shocked by the magnitude of the sanctions that then came. And so now we'll sort of, I think, transition to how sanctions have impacted the Russian economy and whether they've been effective. So in the planning stages before Russia's invasion, the U.S. government, there's a lot of times briefings for people like me that are outside of government but formally in, and there were a lot of briefings about the sanctions planning that was underway, and this is in December, January and into February, before Russia had actually invaded. Because the U.S. government was very clear that we thought Russia was going to invade. And so we were getting ready. But then we were quite concerned about what the Europeans would do. We remembered back to 2014 when we had to drag the EU along. And and we were beginning to have hypothetical exercises with the European Union about what would happen if Russia invaded and what would they do. And most of EU governments did not think that Russia was going to invade. Their intelligence agencies were telling them that wasn't going to happen. But then when Russia did invade, what we saw was that actually the political response in Europe was far stronger than anything we anticipated. And the demand signal sent by senior politicians was to hit Russia with basically everything that they could hit them with in terms of sanctions. And we had, two central bankers, former central bankers, Janet Yellen, our Treasury Secretary, and then Italian Prime Minister Mario Draghi, the former head of the European Central Bank, getting on the phone and just sort of saying, why don't we sanction the Russian central bank and freeze Russian bank assets? That was not even thought of or dreamed of by those in the Treasury and other places, in part because they just didn't think that was politically practical. But then given the total shock that came about, there were so that money has been a lot of that money had been frozen or has been frozen. That has limited, I think, quite severely the Vladimir Putin's budgetary cushion. And I think the initial shock of sanctions nearly caused a real economic crisis in Russia. They were on the cusp of having, I think, a kind of devastating 2008 style collapse of their economy. However, Russia's central bankers are quite effective and nimble. They increased interest rates. They took other measures. And I think the kind of death blow that we were hoping sanctions would cause did not happen. And I think in part that was because of the agility of Russia's economists, as well as the fact that they still have a very robust economy. And then what we saw in 2022 was the countervailing action of high oil prices and the less unwillingness to go after the Russian fossil fuels. So the European Union never sanctioned Russian gas. In May, when the EU suggested doing an oil embargo against Russia, I think the Biden administration almost had a heart attack because there are elections in the US in November. We are very sensitive to high gas prices or high fuel costs. And the Biden administration did not want to have the price of oil spike in the global economy. The price of oil rose anyway. Russian oil was getting on the market. Russia was still able to sell gas to many Europeans. And so Russia actually had this economic windfall of really high energy prices by the war that they caused in many respects. So this contradictory circumstance. However, the EU eventually did establish an oil embargo in December of 2022. That, I think, has proven quite effective at reducing Russian oil revenue. And the explosion of the pipelines of the Nord Stream 1 and 2 has contributed to significantly reducing Russian gas flows into Europe. Now, Russia had already sort of throttled the gas into Europe, trying to create an energy crisis in Europe over the winter. And now some Russian gas is still getting into the European market, but essentially that has also been closed off. Now, there was an effort to do something called an oil price cap, which was the idea was we wanted to keep Russian oil on the global market so that oil prices wouldn't go up, but we wanted to reduce revenue paid to Russia. So we would say that you could only buy oil from Russia at $65 a barrel, so below market cost. I think that has caused some degree of disruption. Now, there's a lot of debate on how effective or ineffective it's been. I think what it has caused is Russia to spend a lot of money to buy a lot of oil tankers, to create a shadow fleet of oil tankers, and I think has softened demand for Russian oil. So I think it has cost Russia money. So that is sort of the macro, but the macroeconomic environment now is Russia had gotten windfall profits, has now it has poured money into its defense sector, and so it's from a macroeconomic perspective somewhat stable. Now, Russia does have a real problem: is that inflation is high, the price of the ruble or the value of the ruble has collapsed, which means that Russia's imports from countries like China and other places, which they're now doing instead of buying from Europe and the United States, are much more costly. So I would view, so have sanctions fail? Well, actually, let me turn to the other aspect of sanctions, which where we tried to, in an unprecedented way, do export controls to prevent Russia from gaining access to critical technologies, systems that it needs for its defense industrial sector. This, I think, has had also a mixed bag where, you look at, how was Russia building its tanks? Well, it was using German machine tools that are highly sophisticated that Germany was continuing to sell to Russia even after 2014. Russian tanks were using French optical systems that were, highly sophisticated. So there was an effort to sort of stop Russia from getting a lot of the advanced components that it needs to build its missiles that it was getting from the West. Also, some materials from the U.S. Now, this is in some ways. In some parts, it was straightforward. Well, if it was a military technology, you could say, don't do that. stop providing that. But a lot of this is commercial off-the-shelf equipment. So what we've seen is that the Russians have found ways around a lot of these export controls, not always effective, by going to China or by going to other suppliers. By doing that, they've oftentimes gotten equipment that's not as good, not as reliable. So Russia may still be able to produce and manufacture things, but what it's producing and manufacturing is of lower quality. It's not as good. They're knockoff systems. However, if you're Ukraine and you're being bombarded by Russian missiles, well, maybe those missiles have a dud rate that's slightly higher, but they're still coming at you. So in that sense, we've degraded the quality of the Russian military equipment, but maybe not impacted its quantity. The other thing is that the Russians have a very effective smuggling operation. They're oftentimes buying equipment through third parties, whether in Central Asia or Turkey. They also have a very elaborate intelligence service that then can act as intermediaries. And so Russia's being able to get many of the parts and components that it was buying before. However, I would view this are sanctions export controls a failure? On the one hand, yes. On the other hand, this is costly. This is costing Russia a lot more money. It's making their supply chains a lot more vulnerable to disruption, whether through arrest or additional sanctions. So Russia is having to pay a lot more to build systems that it could build a lot more cheaply before, because the ruble is devalued and because now it has to use all these intermediaries and cutouts that then all take some money off the top. So I don't think the sanctions have failed. I think they failed at deterring Vladimir Putin. However, I think sanctions are imposing real costs on the Russian economy and the Russian war effort. And I also think from a broader global perspective, and perhaps this is hopefully a lesson that China would take and others, that if you invade another country without cause and justification, that your economy will be battered. And I think sanctions have proven maybe not an ability to deter, but they have shown an ability to strangle an economy. The Iranian economy is not operating the way it could be if it didn't have sanctions. And so I think Russia is much poorer today than it would be if we hadn't put sanctions in place. So maybe I'll stop there.
My gosh, Max, thank you. That's a great presentation of both sides. I guess the obvious question is, Russia's economy is suffering. Does its president give a damn?
So I think so. I think the answer is yes. I think Vladimir Putin has to be worried about economic conditions, and that what is starting to happen, or it's happening, is that the guns versus butter question. So by pouring money into his military and defense industrial complex, that is actually a stimulus to your economy. They're employing a lot of people. The Russian labor market is quite tight. There's jobs to be had by anyone that can work in Russia. But money for schools, money for social safety net programs are, I think, under severe strain. And so I think over time, what you will have is that a population that can, handle sanctions, but one that how disgruntled the public is with the state of conditions inside of Russia. I mean, Putin's bargain with the Russian public for a long time has been, you stay out of politics and the economy will be fine. Well, so if the economy is getting worse and people are dying, I think in a war that makes very little sense, that I think attrits in his broader well of support. Now, what I would say is, does that lead to Putin's collapse? Well, what we've seen, Dan, in our experience in the United States is that, when there is oftentimes profound support for ill thought out wars initially. It took Democrats 2.5 years to come around to oppose the Iraq War. John Kerry didn't do it in 2004 when he was a Democratic candidate. It was really not until the fall of 2005, 2.5 years after the war was going on. Now, that war is far less costly for the United States than what Russia's experienced. It didn't have any economic impact really on the U.S. In Vietnam, something similar occurred as well. So what I would say is, if this is a long war and a war of attrition, sanctions play a role at eroding the home front. And you never know what will be the kind of final blow that changes regime behavior.
Yeah. And Kissinger would say, um, don't expect an easy answer to a complex question like that. We've talked in this course about distinguishing between a country's leader and its population. Russia is one of the most opaque societies that we know of. The Lebedev polls, we don't know if they have any validity. You've probably watched some of the Vox Populi videos, as I have, and the impression you get, again, these are self-selected people in Russia. Russian journalists ask them, are you comfortable with what's happening now? Invariably, their answer is, we blame the West. We blame the West. So we don't know if that's a true cross-section of Russian opinion. We don't know if they're telling the truth when they're being asked in front of a video camera, but there you are. Let's see, Lisa has a question. Let me just ask first, everything you've said is predicated by the strength of the US dollar. I think something like 90% of monetary exchanges in the world go through New York, with a $23 trillion debt and the possibility of the dollar losing its universal appeal compared to, say, the yuan or the euro. What must we think about? It's so easy for the United States to impose sanctions unilaterally. If that ever becomes not as easy, what should we be thinking? Should we be thinking more about working harder to get the EU to work with us? I mean, how should we be thinking of this if the dollar should ever not be the universal currency?
No, it's a great question, Dan. And there's a number of economists looking at this, and I guess my take on their debate that they're having is that the dollar, the centrality of the dollar in the international financial system, I think is maybe eroding, but very gradually, and there's sort of no threat to this it sort of being upended anytime soon. But let's just say it was. Well, I think one of the big evolutions that were in international affairs that we've seen is the EU becoming a very strong geoeconomic actor, acting as one, putting in place incredibly strong sanctions. Now, this has stretched the EU's ability to implement these sanctions because the EU doesn't have an intelligence service. It has to rely on national governments. How it then implements this has been uneven, probably a little bit more uneven than the US. But and the UK, not being in the EU, also is doing sanctions. And when I've heard from some companies that find that there may be some things that the US isn't sanctioning in Russia, but the EU is or the UK is. And so that just means what we've done is made for any respectable business, and most businesses want to be respectable, have just decided, no, it's just impossible, even if they think there might be a way to actually do some business in a way that's not covered. So the EU sanctions, I think, are incredibly important because the euro is an incredibly important currency. And if the EU borrowed a bit more, for instance, as we proposed here at CSIS, EU should borrow funding to support Ukraine and build up its defense sector. That would make the EU more valuable as a reserve currency because the EU doesn't really issue debt right now, which is one of its main limitations.
Yeah, and you pointed out, and we do remember how surprised we were at how quickly the EU was supportive when sanctions became a question. A little bit in 2014, much more in 2022. Did I have something other? I'm just remembering. Do you remember when the British pound was an international hard currency? It still is a hard currency, but its decline was, I don't know how many years you would think of it as not really calling the shots any longer. That's just a stray comment. Lisa Khodorovska, over to you.
Thank you very much. I mean, I have rather, maybe it's not a question, but I would like to hear your comment on a particular thing about when it comes to sanctions. So we speak about how Europe or US in particular are not feeling very happy because of sanctions, which is understandable. But also we should think about some states which are actually winning because of the EU or like Western sanctions. In particular, I think about Central Asia or also Georgia. I mean, Georgia's GDP has risen incredibly through the last two. I mean, I'm a quite frequent visitor to Georgia, and uh, I mean, ideologically, they're not happy about everything that is happening there. But economically, they have never seen such a rise in their economy through the last few decades. So I mean, I just want to maybe you can tell some tendencies, or for example, Central Asia. I've read some reports on Central Asia, and a lot of experts or economists from there say that finally Russia does not, I mean, oversees them as the the countries Russia can cooperate with. And for example, the something Russia was exporting from EU before 2022 is now exporting from Central Asia. And
Mhm.
again, that
Um,
brings a lot of fruits
Yeah.
to
yes.
Kazakhstan and other states. So I'm just curious about these tendencies
Mm.
and how do you see this?
Yeah.
Lisa, let's ask you in turn. You who've been to Tbilisi, we are told that the Russians who say that they're fleeing from military service, maybe they're opportunists, I don't know, but they're not poor. They come with lots of money. Is that one of the causes of the prospering of the Georgian economy, the sudden influx of lots of currency from the outside?
Including, I mean, not so mostly we should understand that Russians who are fleeing to Georgia, they're not staying there for a long time, and a lot of them are actually wanting to go further and go to the Western countries via Georgia. That's why Georgians themselves are very unhappy because the prices for the apartments are super high. The prices for any flying connections are super high. So, for example, even flying from Georgia to Germany, the prices will be super high, not because Germany is a very appealing destination for Georgians, but because Georgian business understand that Russians will probably use that opportunity to go to Europe. And I myself 2 weeks ago met a Russian, very randomly and not by my wish, a Russian on the same table as I was in. It was like a huge urban space in Tbilisi. And I mean, the first thing he told us when he realized, I mean, when he was presenting himself on a big table with a lot of foreigners,
Mhm.
is that, yeah, I mean, I'm not here for a long time. I'll be leaving soon, and I have always wanted to leave. And everyone is, so they're actually spending some money in Tbilisi and then moving forward.
Okay, okay. Max,
Yeah.
your take
No,
on that?
no, I
Yeah.
think what part of what's happening, part of what's happened is the exodus of wealthy Russians that had the means to immediately get out did, and so hence the uh, real estate costs. But when housing prices go up, it does benefit the government somewhat because then tax revenue increases and property taxes and other things like that. But I think when it comes to the effect of sanctions and export controls, this is where um, this is why sanctions enforcement is very hard. So there are legitimate businesses in Georgia that import goods and items from the West and have done before. But so let's say you're a company in Georgia or you're a company in Pennsylvania here in the United States, and suddenly you get an email from this company in Georgia that says, I would like to buy, a whole lot of this. And you look and like Georgia's not sanctioned. Okay, yeah, let's do it. And then that goes to Georgia, and then that just gets driven into transported into Russia. Now, Georgia gets the import tariffs and other things like that. But so that's where sanctions enforcement is difficult. And so we've seen those increases in the Turkey as well, Central Asia. Um, there's been a lot of U.S. government outreach to these countries. But our leverage, the U.S. leverage with certain countries is not, sometimes not all that extensive. And these countries will say we're doing whatever we can. Some things are not illegal, and that's what Turkey is saying. So how do we can respond with secondary sanctions. This is something the EU has long opposed, which are secondary sanctions where we sanction not the we sanction basically Turkey because Turkey is not enforcing our sanctions. Now we did this against the Europeans during the Trump administration because when we pulled out of the JCPOA, the nuclear agreement with Iran, that the EU was following through and therefore providing services to Iran, so we were sanctioning them. The Europeans were furious. So, but are we going to sanction Turkey when we're trying to get Sweden into NATO? When Turkey's a NATO member? When we have other fish to fry with Turkey? So this is where diplomacy is difficult, where there's trade-offs, and also with Kazakhstan and other countries where they'll be like, maybe, and sometimes for these countries, they don't quite have the means to enforce sometimes U.S. directives, right? They're like, you've created a huge bureaucratic, law enforcement nightmare for us, Kazakhstan or whatever country, and you expect us to be able to just like crack down on these legitimate Kazakh businesses. How are we going to do this? So this is where sanctions are leaky. It's more of an art than a science, I would say, in terms of enforcement. But what you're also then seeing is that some of the money of these transactions and other things is staying in Kazakhstan. So that's actually adding to the costs that the Russians have to pay to acquire what they want to acquire. So I think this is, again, a problem. The U.S. government, I think, is well aware of it, but it's more, and I think what's important, what's actually very useful, this is where it's useful, the role that the Ukrainian government is playing. When the Ukrainians open up a missile and they find U.S. parts and components in that missile that just struck a Ukrainian city, that's really important. When the press are highlighting, as the Financial Times just did, how Turkey and other places are being used to route illicit goods, that then creates political pressure. Political pressure creates pressure on the bureaucracy to do something, and that then I think can help lead to action. So this is all very reinforcing.
We have 24 Kazakhs on this call. Maybe one of them might have a comment. Let's see. I see a hand. I can't tell yet who that is. From Nairobi. Let's get to that in a moment. But I guess we should mention that Kazakh exports petroleum itself, is not under sanctions, and maybe benefits from having its neighbor under sanctions when it is not. Is that possible?
Well, I mean, this is where economists are very annoying people, because they always there's on the one hand, on the other hand.
Yeah. Okay.
And so in free market capitalist economies, you take an action to stop something. Well, you've also created a business opportunity for something else. So a famous case is prohibition here in the United States, where we banned alcohol and drinking went up.
Yeah.
And we figured out ways to get alcohol in all sorts of illicit and illegal ways. So that's where, again, needing to sort of be intelligent about how the sanctions that you design. Now, sometimes, and so if you do it too broadly, it cannot necessarily have the impact that you perhaps wanted to have.
And you talked about workarounds earlier through espionage and shady deals. With India and China very happy to pay lower prices for Russian petroleum, maybe that makes them all happy. India, China, and Russia.
I think India is a good example of some of the limitations that we have diplomatically with sanctions. One thing I would say is that we did a report earlier this fall looking at the impact of the war on Russian arms sales abroad. How has that impacted Russia's ability to sell arms? Now, what we found, because the arms export industry is very important to Russia's economy, is that actually it was in 2017, the U.S. adopted sanctions against Russian defense industry, and that had a real impact on a country's willingness to buy Russian goods. Now, if you're a country like India, that the United States is desperate to have a stronger relationship with, as we mentioned at the beginning, and your entire defense sector is dependent on Soviet Russian era equipment and parts and components, in part because of some of the actions of the U.S. earlier during the Cold War, well, that limits your ability to adhere to the sanctions. And so the U.S. has had a tough diplomatic needle to thread on how much pressure do we put on the Indians to sort of diversify away, which the Indians are doing, but yet recognize that India has its own national security needs and interests and will tell us to go jump in a lake if we push them too hard.
Provide the link, please. We have a questioner from Nairobi. Max, we have a generic name, which is Peterson Wawero. That doesn't mean it's Peter, but we have a comment from Nairobi. Go ahead, you are unmuted.
Thank you, Dan. Can you hear me?
Absolutely, yes.
Thank you, Max, for such an. My name is Abisage Boyani.
Thank you, and I reread your bio yesterday, Abisage. Amazing, amazing. We're so honored that you're with this group.
Thank you. Now, Max, thank you for the in-depth insight discussions you've had with us on sanctions. And I was looking at the gap, the period between 2014 and 2022. That will be President Obama's last term and Donald Trump. But I'm looking at, since Roosevelt proceeding on to Bill, President Clinton tried to have a warmer relationship with President Yeltsin. They had great bilaterals to a point where he didn't see the need for a Cold War strategy. Moving on to Trump, he tried to warm up with the Kremlin, but the Senate was not any easier on him. They kept on slapping the Kremlin with the sanctions. But then that is a time Russia had the advantage to absorb sanctions. What do you have to say about that period?
Yeah.
Fascinating. Thank you,
Yeah.
Abisage.
So I think it is the case that, in the post-Cold War period, I think each American president has tried to reset relations. I think President Biden even tried to, when he came in office, have a stable and predictable relationship. It wasn't going to be a warm relationship, but at least try to kind of mellow tensions. I think what you saw is that basically the first 20 years after the Cold War, so during the 90s, during the Bush administration, the George W. Bush administration, in the beginning of the Obama administration, really until I think 2011, the United States from 91 to 2011 was trying to expand our economic engagement with Russia, and this is true with Europe as well, with the idea that economic interaction would lead to greater engagement, and that would push Russia on a more liberal, if not democratic, path. I think Putin clearly, I think, rejected that. The protests that happened against Putin coming back to power in December of 2011, I think really impacted that. And then Russia's invasion of Ukraine shifted U.S. strategy. What we saw during the Trump administration was President Trump had wanted warm ties with Vladimir Putin and with Russia. And so we saw, I think, a decrease in energy in enforcing the sanctions that had been on the books already in 2014. And in 2017, the U.S. adopted even harder sanctions, in part in response to Trump's affinity, I would say, toward Russia. Yet, I don't think we saw sort of aggressive U.S. government implementation of those sanctions. And I think that lack of implementation was just seen in Russia as like sanctions aren't going to really impact us all that much. And that contributed to the lack of deterrent that I think President Biden was hoping to have. And now I think there is a big question about how the enforcement goes and where does the Russian economy go. And so how will people look at Russia's economy in 5 years from now? And will they say, nah, sanctions didn't really have a huge impact and Russia was able to absorb them? Or will they say, like, no, Russia is much poorer today because of sanctions? And I think that's the big question.
Thank you for that. Let's go back to Ukraine with Veronika Sheptuchowska. Can you unmute?
Yes.
Oh, good.
First of all, hi, Max, thank you for your expertise. I have a question that is not related directly to the topic of sanctions, but nevertheless, I'm interested on your thoughts about the possibility of making Russia paying the reparations after the war ends. Someday we all hope for that. How is it possible to make Russia pay it? And you spoke today about those frozen Russian assets. Maybe they can be used, and if so, what is the mechanism for use them?
Yeah, Veronica's referring to the many billions that have been frozen in bank accounts. And it's a big legal question. And would it create a precedent of loss of confidence in the banking system? Right, Max?
Yeah, so it's a great question. I think and I think this really needs to be an area where more pressure probably needs to be applied. So to governments, because in part, the concerns of the central bankers and others is that this could be seen as sort of an illegal seizure if that money is sort of, right now it's frozen, but if it's actually used for other purposes. And so some of what the way I understand it, some of what needs to happen is some of the laws in European countries and other places where this money is being seized, and that was one challenge, is actually accounting and identifying where all this money is, because money can be sort of fungible. And then those laws in those countries may need to adjust or change for this. Now, they should do that because I think that provides Ukraine with access to funds that then it could use right now to procure military equipment to aid its economic recovery. So I think all of that is fairly essential. There have been proposals to take the interest. So when money is sitting in an account, it accrues interest. Interest rates are high. Russia's actually, this money, the pot is growing like an investment. So you could take the money. One idea is to just take the money that has been accrued and provide that to Ukraine. I think that's a good stopgap measure, but I think more probably needs to be done. And there are, I think, non-trivial systemic concerns on the part of some of those economists that are kind of look at this. I don't quite know enough of the details there. What I would say on reparations is I think we need to be a little careful here with reparations. I think the problem with reparations is morally, it is entirely correct. Russia deserves to pay for what it is doing to Ukraine. However, I do think the experience with reparations, I mean, the obvious example is interwar Germany, is that they can have a backlash, number one. But I think most importantly, when I look right now at Russian sentiment toward the war, this was a war they were not prepared to fight. There was not months of messaging to the Russian public about how they needed to go to war in Ukraine. This was a war suddenly thrust upon them. And now I think the mood of the Russian public is my country wrong or right. But I do think there's also an attitude of that what happens if Russia loses the war? Well, they'll be set with endless reparations and will be, I think, forever screwed economically and will still be isolated. So their only path forward for Russia is to continue to fight this war. So I think that the problem that I see with reparations is I think it essentially hardens Russia's willingness to just keep going. And so I propose, and I think it's hasn't gotten quite the warmest of audiences in the administration for reasons that I fully understand, but that we need to have also a positive message to the Russian public that actually treating this more as Putin's war, even if that's not fully the case, and I appreciate that, because I think what you're trying to do is erode Russian public support to continuing this disastrous war. And so you're trying to make the economic costs be real, We're trying to provide as many weapons to Ukraine as possible so that Ukraine can make this as costly as a war for Russia as possible. And I think you want the Russian public to be like, we don't need to do this. And to make that last point, if we talk about what Russia will pay after the war is over, I think you harden Russian attitudes. And I think what we want is to soften Russian support. So I don't, reparations, I think, is a conversation that we should probably not discuss too openly, and is a question for maybe to see how this war ends, and then we get to that topic. But I think right now it's a better message to be sending that actually, if they end this war and get rid of their leader in the Kremlin, they would have a better future as well.
Again, just anecdotally, if we look at the Vox Populi videos, we see again we will never know how accurate this is across the broad public, but people tend to blame the West for the situation. People in Russia, that is. There were a couple of hands up, and I welcome you to come back. Any of the three of
Dan,
you.
I am unfortunately going to have.
Are you in a hard stop? Okay.
I'm already late for my meeting.
Oh my gosh!
If there's one or two questions, I can take them super fast.
Well, here's a this won't be a fast one, but JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, Iran. It kind of worked under John Kerry, and then it fell apart. Was it even worth trying to give the carrot and stick to Iran on nuclear development? Was there any chance that would succeed?
It's a good point, because I think this is an example of where I think sanctions were quite successful. That we used sanctions against Iran, and then we offered the carrot of how they could get out from under sanctions. One of the dilemmas that we oftentimes see with sanctions is we set them and then forget them, and then a country doesn't have any path to changing their behavior to really get out from under sanctions. This was different. We put in place sanctions against Iran. We said their economy was not doing, was suffering. You had leadership that was eager to sort of explore softening relations with the United States. And I think was effective at delaying and putting the Iranian nuclear program on ice. Trump, I think, was a grand mistake to rip up the JCPOA. And now we see the Iranian nuclear program has dramatically advanced far ahead of schedule. And relations between the U.S. and Iran are terrible, and probably never, are not at a point where they're going to recover anytime soon. So to me, that was a mistake, and showed the leverage that could be gained from sanctions.
Thank you, Max. And it brings us back to the beginning, which was Kissinger, who would say, think of the long term and don't be caught up in the short term. Max, kind of sorry to make you late for your other meeting, but we will make you late whenever you let us. Thank you so much.
No, it's great to be with all of you, and Dan, thanks so much for having me, and all the best to everybody.
Terrific. Thank you, Max Bergmann.
Bye.
We can stay on, Ellie, if anybody has any follow-up comments. If not, somebody from Nairobi. Let me just say, people will drift off, I'm sure. Next week, I will put this on Google Blackboard, of course. Paul Foldy will join us. He was a senior staffer in the legislative branch doing foreign policy for the House of Representatives as a staffer. He'll be with us on Monday. On Thursday, we'll have Thomas Kent, who was until recently the director of Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty. That is certain to be interesting. So as people drift off gradually, let's go to Nairobi. And
Peter?
Yes, go ahead. We can hear you. Yep. Is this Peter?
Yes, Peter Mbuva, yes.
Peter Mbuva, thank
thank
you.
you so much.
Yes.
Dan, well, Max has done an exciting, so fascinating presentation on sanctions. I'm really impressed. One thing I would like also to point is that sanctions are good because they avert use of war as a means to solving solutions. So from a foreign policy perspective, it's cost-benefit analysis, that a leader will use cost-benefit analysis to ensure that the means that they use to deter and that not cause more damage. However, when I look at prior to 24th of February of 2022, when Ukraine was attacked, there are some official statements that were issued by Putin, saying that as a country, they had prepared so much. One of their grand strategy, I saw one of their military saying that they had put in place so much in terms of military size, investment, and therefore he said that was a special operation. And then the deterrence, the sanctions could not stop that. They still went ahead and attacked. And we have seen, Professor Dan, some shift in terms of trade, other blocks coming up. Now we have BRICS being strengthened to overtake other international or strong bodies. What is your take on that? Does US care, or because of the strength of their dollar, they would say, provided that we are the one controlling the market, we do not care. And yes.
Yeah, Peterson raises a fascinating point, which is that many countries in the global south are turning away. In fact, our recent topic, the so-called rules-based liberal international order, I've been shocked myself to see the degree to which the global south, led by China and Russia, is going away from this rules-based order. The BRICS, which Peter mentions, is a very important alternative. It's very understandable that maybe Peter can remind us, there are something like 10 to 15 countries in the BRICS movement, which has recently expanded to include 2 more African countries. And clearly we're seeing the global south looking for other options in their trade regimens, protocols, that what we've had up until now is questionable, requires reform, and it's not a given that the rules-based international world order will survive much longer. We really don't know. And again, of course, that's not much of an answer, Peter, but I would say it's understandable that the global south is looking for options, and we should expect more of this. And we should be smart enough to have responses that would be mutually beneficial to the more wealthy countries and the global south. Everybody could benefit. Just mentioning in passing, many of you are familiar with Joseph Nye. Hard power, smart power, soft power. Joseph Nye defines this pretty clearly. Economic sanctions are kind of, we don't really know where to put them. Is this hard power or smart power? I would say smart. Hard power, I think of as military kinetic operations, the use of real physical coercion. Sanctions, which some people put in the category of hard power, kind of between hard and smart, isn't it? And as we should be aware of these distinctions made by Joseph Nye 25 years ago, and he was until recently the director of the Harvard Kennedy School, and came from the military. His background was U.S. military, and he gave us many insights on the importance of soft power, which is, he defines it something like convincing another party, it could be a country or a person, convincing that person or party to change their behavior through persuasion. It's a very important distinction. We owe Joseph Nye a great debt in making these concepts easily understood. Peter, what is your own take on BRICS? Are BRICS going to draw the global south largely or entirely away from the conventional system we've had until now?
Very good question, Dan. Yes, BRICS could be taking center stage, but however, because of a long time independency by most of the African countries, there is that fear of wait and see they are not very much convinced of shifting.
Mhm.
And I give example of our own country, yes,
Mhm.
because of our long ties with Britain being our colonizer, and of course the strategic positioning, we may not be very much willing to join the BRICS. However, they are coming out clearly as an option that the developed world has imperialized African countries, and this is the time. So depending on how they voice and amplify the audience, to be able to get a sizable audience, yes, it could achieve some results.
Well, I think we can agree that as we're watching these horrible conflicts in Ukraine, in Gaza, in Sudan, in South Sudan, there's something like 100 of them. As we're waiting and watching, wanting a resolution of these horrible situations, in the meantime, we should also pay increased attention to the global South, to its needs, its perceptions, and its actions. It's very consequential what we don't know if the global South will act together or in a fragmented way. It's something that we really must be paying attention to. And thanks, Peter, for bringing that up. I think we will leave on that thought today. This has been a great exchange. Thank you, Lisa. Thank you, Peter. Thank you. I have it written down, but those who, Abisage, thank you very much. And Veronica, really grateful for your insights and your questions. Max clearly enjoyed being with us today. And I know I learned from him. I hope we all did. Thank you for today. Bye-bye.